Chapter 22 of 17. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Jonathan Burchard, August 2009. 17 by Booth Tarkington, Chapter 22. Foreshadowings. Now the last rose had blown. The dandelion globes were long since on the wind. Gladioli and golden glow and salvia were here. The season moved toward asters and the goldenrod. This haloed summer still idled on its way, yet all the while sped quickly, like some languid lady in an elevator. There came a Sunday, very hot. Mr. and Mrs. Baxter, having walked a scorched half-mile from church, drooped thankfully into wicker chairs on their front porch, though Jane, who had accompanied them, immediately darted away, swinging her hat by its ribbon and skipping as lithesomely as if she had just come forth upon a cool morning. "I don't know how she does it," her father moaned, glancing after her and drying his forehead temporarily upon a handkerchief. "That would merely kill me dead, after walking in this heat." Then, for a time, the two were content to sit in silence, nodding to occasional acquaintances who passed in the desultory after-church procession. Mr. Baxter fanned himself with sporadic little bursts of energy which made his straw hat creak, and Mrs. Baxter sighed with the heat and gently rocked her chair. But as a group of 5 young people passed along the other side of the street, Mr. Baxter abruptly stopped fanning himself, and following the direction of his gaze, Mrs. Baxter ceased to rock. In half-completed attitudes they leaned slightly forward, sharing one of those pauses of parents who unexpectedly behold their offspring. "My soul," said William's father, "hasn't that girl gone home yet?" "He looks pale to me," Mrs. Baxter murmured absently. "I don't think he seems at all well lately." During 17 years, Mr. Baxter had gradually learned not to protest anxieties of this kind, unless he desired to argue with no prospect of ever getting a decision. "Hasn't she got any home?" he demanded testily. "Isn't she ever going to quit visiting the Parchers and let people have a little peace?" Mrs. Baxter disregarded this outburst as he had disregarded her remark about William's pallor. "You mean Miss Pratt?" she inquired dreamily, her eyes following the progress of her son. "No, he really doesn't look well at all." "Is she going to visit the Parchers all summer?" Mr. Baxter insisted. "She already has, about," said Mrs. Baxter. "Look at that boy," the father grumbled, "mooning along with all those other mooncalves. Can't even let her go to church alone. I wonder how many weeks of time, counting it out in hours, he's wasted that way this summer." "Oh, I don't know. You see, he never goes there in the evening." "Well, what of that? He's there all day, isn't he? What do they find to talk about? That's the mystery to me. Day after day, hours and hours. My soul, what do they say?" Mrs. Baxter laughed indulgently. "People are always wondering that about the other ages. Poor Willie. I think that a great deal of the time their conversation would be probably about as inconsequent as it is now. You see, Willie and Joe Bullitt are walking one on each side of Miss Pratt, and Johnny Watson has to walk behind with May Parcher. Joe and Johnny are there about as much as Willie is, and of course it's often his turn to be nice to May Parcher. He hasn't many chances to be tete-a-tete with Miss Pratt. Well, she ought to go home. I want that boy to get back into his senses. He's in an awful state." "I think she is going soon," said Mrs. Baxter. "The Parchers are to have a dance for her Friday night, and I understand there's to be a floor laid in the yard, and great things. It's a farewell party." "That's one mercy, anyhow." "And if you wonder what they say," she resumed, "why, probably they're all talking about the party. And when Willie is alone with her, well, what does anybody say?" Mrs. Baxter interrupted herself to laugh. "Jane, for instance. She's always fascinated by that darky Genesis when he's at work here in the yard, and they have long, long talks. I've seen them from the window. What on earth do you suppose they talk about? That's where Jane is now. She knew I'd told Genesis I'd give him something if he'd come and freeze the ice cream for us today, and when we got here she heard the freezer and hopped right around there. If you went out to the back porch you'd find them talking steadily, but what on earth about, I couldn't guess to save my life." And yet nothing could have been simpler, as a matter of fact. Jane and Genesis, attended by Clematis, were talking about society. That is to say, their discourse was not sociologic. Rather, it was of the frivolous and elegant. Watteau prevailed with them over John Stuart Mill. In a word, They spoke of the beau monde. Genesis turned the handle of the freezer with his left hand, allowing his right the freedom of gesture which was an intermittent necessity when he talked. In the matter of dress, Genesis had always been among the most informal of his race, but today there was a change almost unnerving to the Caucasian eye. He wore a balloonish suit of purple, strangely scalloped at pocket and cuff, and more strangely decorated with lines of small parasite buttons, in color blue, obviously buttons of leisure. His bulbous new shoes flashed back yellow fire at the embarrassed sun, and his collar, for he had gone so far, sent forth other sparkles, playing upon a polished surface over an inner graining of soot. Beneath it hung a simple, white, soiled evening tie, draped in a manner unintended by its manufacturer, and heavily overburdened by a green glass medallion of the Emperor Tiberius, set in brass. "Yes'm," said Genesis. "And now I'm in at swim. Flyin' round every night with all them blue-vein people, I say, must go buy me some blue-vein clothes. If I'm goin' to start, might as well start high. So first, I buy me this here gold necktie pin with this here lady's face carved out of green diamond, sittin' in the middle of all that gold. Nen I buy me pair Royal King shoes. I got a friend of mine, this here Bluey Blowers. He say Royal King shoes same kind of shoes he wear, and I walk straight in that store where they keep 'em at. Don't waste my time showin' me no old-time shoes, I say. Run out some of them big yellow lump-toed Royal Kings befo' my eyes, and first pair fit me I pay price, and wear 'em right off on me. Now I got me this here suit of clothes. Sign on 'em in a window. If you wish to be best dressed man in town, take me home for $6.97. That's kind of suit Genesis need, I say. If Genesis goin' to start dressin' high, might as well start top." Jane nodded gravely, comprehending the reasonableness of this view. "What made you decide to start, Genesis?" she asked earnestly. "I mean, how did it happen you began to get this way?" "Well, sah, 'tall come 'bout right like kind of slidin' into it 'stid of hoppin' and jumpin'. I spendin' the evenin' at lady's house, Fanny what cooked next door last year. Well, sah, 'at Lady Fanny, she quit private cookin'. She cateless." "She's what?" Jane asked. "What's that mean, Genesis? Cateless?" "She caters," he explained. "If it's a man, you call him a cater. If it's a lady, she's a cateless. She does catin' for all them blue-vein families in town. She make refreshments, bring waiters. 'At's catin'. You ma give big dinner, she have Fanny cater, and don't take no trouble 'tall herself. Fanny take all 'at trouble." "I see," said Jane. "But I don't see how her being a cateless started you to dressin' so high, Genesis." "This here way. Fanny say, 'Look here, Genesis, I got big job tomorrow night, and I'm man short. Kind of havin' to have a 'nouncer." "A what?" "Fanny talk just that way. Goin' to be a big dinner party. And this here blue-vein family tell Fanny they want whole lot extry sploogin'. Tell her put fine-lookin' colored man stand by drawin' room do'. You ask everybody name, and holler out whatever name they say, just as they walk in. This yer family say they goin' show what's what in this town, and they bound family go get 'em a 'nouncer. Well, what's matter you doin' at 'nouncin'? Fanny say. "Who, me?" I tell her. "Yes, you kin, too," she said, and she say she lend me 'at waiter suit used to b'long ole Henry Gimlet what died when he owin' Fanny $16, and Fanny tuck and keep 'at waiter suit. She use 'at suit on extry waiters when she got some on her hands what ain't got no waiter suit. You wear 'at suit, Fanny say, and you be good announcer, 'cause you a fine big man and got big grand voice. Nen you learn before long to be a waiter, Genesis, and get $1.50 every evenin' you waitin', 'sides all 'at money you make cuttin' grass daytime. Well, sah, I standin' up doin' 'at announcin' very next night. White lady and gentleman walk towards my door. I stepped up to 'em this-a-way." Here Genesis found it pleasant to present the scene with some elaboration. He dropped the handle of the freezer, rose, assumed a stately but ingratiating expression, and stepped up to the imagined couple, using a pacing and rhythmic gait, a conservative prance, which plainly indicated the simultaneous operation of an orchestra. Then, bending graciously, as though the persons addressed were of dwarfish stature, "'Scuse me," he said, "but can I please be so polite as to 'quire your name?" For a moment he listened attentively, then nodded, and returning with the same aristocratic undulations to an imaginary doorway near the freezer, Mr. and Mrs. Orlosco Rinktum, he proclaimed sonorously. Who? Cried Jane, fascinated. Genesis, announce that again, right away. Genesis heartily complied. Mr. and Mrs. Orlosco Rinktum, he bawled. Was that really their names? She asked eagerly. Well, I kind of forget, Genesis admitted, resuming his work with the freezer. Seems like I recollect somebody got named good deal like what I say, 'cause some mighty blue-vein names at that dinner party, yes, sir. But I only get to be 'nouncer one time, 'cause Fanny telling me next family have dinner party make heap of fun. Say, I done my 'nouncing good, but say, what's the use hollerin' names just for some of the neighbors or their own aunts and uncles to walk in, when everybody already knows 'em? So Fanny promote me to waiter, and I round right in amongst big doin's most every night. Pass ice cream, lemonade, lemon ice, cake, sandwiches. Let me hand you a little more chicken salad, ma'am. Let me be so kind as to get you fresh cup of coffee, sir. Sway old Genesis talkin' every even these days. Jane looked at him thoughtfully. Do you like it better than cutting grass, Genesis? She asked. He paused to consider. Yes'm. When band play all them tunes, my goodness, do sound grand. You can't do it tonight, though, Genesis, said Jane. You have to be quiet on Sunday nights, don't you? Yes'm. Ain't got no more catin' till next Friday even. Oh, I bet that's the party for Miss Pratt at Mr. Parcher's, Jane cried. Didn't I guess right? Yes'm, I reckon I'm a-goin' see one you family at night, see him dancin', wait on him at refreshments. Jane's expression became even more serious than usual. Willie? I don't know whether he's goin', Genesis. Land name, Genesis exclaimed. He'd die if he don't get invited to 'at ball. Oh, he's invited, said Jane. Only I think maybe he won't go. My goodness, why ain't he goin'? Jane looked at her friend studiously before replying. Well, it's a secret, she said finally, but it's a very interesting one, and I'll tell you if you never tell. Yes'm, I ain't tellin' nobody. Jane glanced around, then stepped a little closer and told the secret with the solemnity it deserved. Well, when Miss Pratt first came to visit Miss May Parcher, Willie used to keep Papa's evening clothes in his window seat, and Mama wondered what had become of them. Then, after dinner, he'd slip up there and put 'em on him, and go out through the kitchen and call on Miss Pratt. Then Mama found 'em, and she thought he oughtn't to do that, so she didn't tell him or anything, and she didn't even tell Papa. But she had the tailor make 'em ever and ever so much bigger, 'cause they were getting too tight for Papa. And well, so after that, even if Willie could get 'em out of Mama's clothes closet where she keeps 'em now, he'd look so funny in 'em he couldn't wear 'em. Well, and then he couldn't go to pay calls on Miss Pratt in the evening since then, because Mama says after he started to go there in that suit, he couldn't go without it. Or maybe Miss Pratt, or the other ones that's in love of her, would think it was pretty queer, and maybe kind of expect that it was Papa's all the time. Mama says she thinks Willie must have worried a good deal over reasons to say why he'd always go in the daytime after that, and never came in the evening. And now they're going to have this party, and she says he's been getting paler and paler every day since he heard about it. Mama says he's pale some because Miss Pratt's going away, but she thinks it's a good deal more because, well, if he would wear those evening clothes just to go callin', how would it be to go to that party and not have any? That's what Mama thinks, and, Genesis, you promised you'd never tell as long as you live. Yes'm, I ain't tellin', Genesis chuckled. I'm a-goin' to get me one of them waiter suits before long myself, so's I can quit wearin' that old Henry gimlet suit what belonged to Fanny, and have me a private suit of my own. They's a second-hand store over on the avenue, where they got swallertail suits all way from $7 to $19.98. Jane started, interrupting him. Shh, she whispered, laying a finger warningly upon her lips. William had entered the yard at the back gate, and approaching over the lawn, had arrived at the steps of the porch before Jane perceived him. She gave him an apprehensive look, but he passed into the house absent-mindedly, not even flinching at sight of Clematis. And Mrs. Baxter was right. William did look pale. "I guess he didn't hear us," said Jane, when he had disappeared into the interior. "He acts awful funny," she added, thoughtfully. "First, when he was in love of Miss Pratt, he'd be mad about somepin' almost every minute he was home. Couldn't anybody say anything to him, but he'd just behave as if it was frightful. And then if you'd see him out walking with Miss Pratt, well, he'd look like Jane paused. Her eye fell upon Clematis, and by a happy inspiration she was able to complete her simile with remarkable accuracy. He'd look like the way Clematis looks at people. That's just exactly the way he'd look, Genesis, when he was walking with Miss Pratt. And then, when he was home, he got so quiet he couldn't answer questions and wouldn't hear what anybody said to him at table or anywhere. And Papa'd nearly almost bust. Mama and Papa'd talk and talk about it, and she lowered her voice, and I knew what they were talking about. Well, and then he'd hardly ever get mad any more. He'd just sit in his room, and sometimes he'd sit in there without any light, or he'd sit out in the yard all by himself all evening, maybe, and the other evening, after I was in bed, I heard him, and Papa said, well, this is what Papa told Mama. And again, lowering her voice, she proffered the quotation from her father in a tone somewhat awestruck. Papa said, by gosh, if he ever thought a son of his could make such a word idiot of himself, he almost wished we'd both been girls. Having completed this report in a violent whisper, Jane nodded repeatedly for emphasis, and Genesis shook his head to show that he was as deeply impressed as she wished him to be. I guess, she added, after a pause, I guess Willie didn't hear anything you and I talked about him, or clothes, or anything. She was mistaken in part. William had caught no reference to himself, but he had overheard something, and he was now alone in his room, thinking about it almost feverishly. A second-hand stove over on the avenue where they got swaller-tail suits all way from $7 to $19.98. Civilization is responsible for certain longings in the breast of man, artificial longings, but sometimes as poignant as hunger and thirst. Of these, the strongest are those of the maid for the bridal veil, of the lad for long trousers, and of the youth for a tailed coat of state. To the gratification of this last, only a few of the early joys in life are comparable. Indulged youth, too rich, can know, to the unctuous full, neither the longing nor the gratification, but one such as William, in moderate circumstances, is privileged to pant for his first evening clothes as the hart panteth after the water-brook, and sometimes to pant in vain. Also, this was a crisis in William's life. In addition to his yearning for such apparel, he was racked by a passionate urgency. As Jane had so precociously understood, unless he should somehow manage to obtain the proper draperies, he could not go to the farewell dance for Miss Pratt. Other unequipped boys could go in their ordinary best clothes, but William could not, for, alack, he had dressed too well too soon. He was in desperate case. The sorrow of the approaching great departure was but the heavier because it had been so long deferred. To William it had seemed that this flower-strewn summer could actually end no more than he could actually die. But time had begun its awful lecture, and even 17 was listening. Miss Pratt, that magic girl, was going home. End of chapter 22.